Hello, and welcome to another video about Maegor the Cruel, this time about why he is Henry VIII. This one isn't scripted, if you can't tell already, because it's not like a grand theory video. It's just, some fun historical parallels. I probably won't bother doing that much editing on this. It'll probably be just a quick one, but at the same time, it's always fun, isn't it, to look at something in A Song of Ice and Fire and compare it to something that actually happened. We love that, don't we? We love that with the Anarchy. We love it with the Glencoe Massacre, all that good stuff. And this is one that I don't hear talked about that often, so I thought, why not? Why not delve into it a bit? And there's lots of fun similarities to get into. So let's start with the most obvious one, which I've probably put on the thumbnail of this video, which is the Six Wives. It's not just the Six Wives, but that is the headline stat. Maegor had 6 wives. Henry VIII famously had 6 wives. It is one of the sort of 3 things that all British school children have to learn. In school, we learnt, the very important mnemonic: divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. You'll find that all British children know that one, because all the ones who failed to learn it were fed to the Queen's corgis. I suppose they must have some other method of disposing of them now. Probably get turned into like sparkling wine to power the King's car or something. But regardless, we all know that metric, so we'll be seeing how the Queens stack up along that as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at these 6 wives of Henry VIII. We're going to have a look at the 6 wives of Maegor the Cruel and see if we can sort of play some pairs, bit of snap, match them up. And where better to start with that than with the reason why Maegor and Henry decide to have multiple wives in the first place. And it's the same reason, and it has the same effect as well. So Henry VIII, for those of you who don't know, King of England between 1509 and 1547, married Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, in 1509, the same year he became king. The problem that Henry VIII had is the same one that Maegor had. He couldn't have any sons. Now, Henry VIII did have a daughter with Catherine of Aragon, Mary, who would go on to become Mary I. But so it's in the sort of, England had at that time never had a ruling queen apart from Matilda, who you'll know about if you watched my other historical parallel video. But it was all about the sons. So Henry VIII wanted a son, and he becomes increasingly frustrated with Catherine of Aragon, just as Maegor becomes increasingly frustrated with Cerise Hightower, because they can't have any sons. It's just not happening. And that is what prompts Henry VIII and Maegor to go looking for other wives, and eventually choosing to break with the church in order to do so. In Henry VIII's case, he ended up pretty much he did end up founding the Church of England, ushering in Protestantism in England, while Maegor the Cruel breaks with the faith in a slightly different way. He doesn't really found his own religion, he just says he can do what he wants, and the faith has to put up with it, or, as it turns out, not. So that's where we begin with our comparison. And we can start with Cerise Hightower as Catherine of Aragon parallel. There's the obvious stuff, they don't have any kids or no sons anyway, and that's the problem, and that's why they need to be gotten rid of by the king. There's the fact that the church is broken over them, over this matter. They're both older than their respective king, they're both married for by far the longest time out of any of the wives. Cerise Hightower is married from 25 to 45 AC, and Catherine of Aragon is married from 1509 to 1533, whereas all the other wives of both of them barely make it a few years. They don't have a good shelf life, these later wives. And so that stuff is like the big stuff, right? That's why Cerise Hightower is very similar to Catherine of Aragon. But there's also other little things, right? Like the fact that so Cerise Hightower, her journey as Maegor's queen, kind of goes on the same trajectory as Catherine of Aragon's. She initially doesn't accept the next wife, Alice Haraway, just as Catherine of Aragon doesn't accept Anne Boleyn. And as a result, they both get sort of exiled from court. They both get their servants and their household taken away from them. They're living in, it's not exactly squalor, but it's squalor if you're a queen, and if sort of scandalous that that's happening. And they both refuse to acknowledge the king's other wives. Though there is a difference here where Cerise eventually gives in and relents and acknowledges Maegor's other wives, whereas Catherine of Aragon never does, and dies in 1536, still protesting that she is the one true Queen of England. And speaking of when she dies, Catherine of Aragon, when she dies, there's a rumour that goes round that she was poisoned by Henry and possibly, Anne Boleyn, the sort of evil, sorceress. And similarly, with Maegor, there's a rumour that Cerise Hightower was killed by Maegor, or on Maegor's orders, which could be true. I mean, I think it's true. I'd said so in my other video, pretty much. But it is just a rumour, whereas historians are pretty clear that Catherine of Aragon just died of natural causes, maybe cancer. Another comparison is that they both have family sort of adjacent to the church. So the reason the church is really sort of pro Henry and Maegor keeping their original wife, and there's multiple reasons for this. Obviously, there's the religious reason that you're not supposed to just divorce your wife just because she's not having any kids. It's not really a justifiable reason at this point in time. It's a long time before the no-fault divorce law. But on top of that, the church in Song of Ice and Fire doesn't wants Cerise Hightower to remain queen because she's I believe she's the niece of the High Septon. So, and it's the whole Faith Hightower alliance. And similarly, Catherine of Aragon, she's not related to the Pope, but she is related to the Pope's jailer. She is the aunt of Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, who, at the time that Henry VIII is trying to get rid of his wife, the Pope has lost a war to Charles V, and Charles V sort of controls him. He's like a puppet Pope at this point. So if Charles V says, I don't really want you to accept my aunt being kicked out, and also my cousin Mary being excluded from the line of succession, don't really want that. So Henry VIII can't really get anywhere with that, and he's never able to convince the Pope to let him get a divorce. And of course, Cerise Hightower was divorced. Is Catherine of Aragon both divorced? Although I should mention here that divorced is technically not the right term, it's annulled, because that's the legal way of making it so that the marriage never technically existed, which is how you justify, for example, making Mary a bastard, whereas if it was a divorce, she wouldn't be. And also that's the reason for why, technically, if someone else says, how many wives did Henry VIII have? The correct answer is 2, because 4 of them were legally annulled, the 2 that were divorced, and obviously the 2 that were beheaded legally, their marriages were written off. But anyway, so yeah, that's a lot of Cerise Hightower, Catherine of Aragon parallels. I think some of them, are possibly just coincidences, like the relation to the church, probably a coincidence, and a lot of it is kind of stuff that you kind of logically expect to follow on from, if you're a queen and the king is trying to set you aside, you're probably going to be a bit annoyed about that. You're probably not going to accept him going outside the bounds of the church to get rid of you, that kind of thing. So, is it intentional? Maybe not. Next up, moving on to the second wives, we have Alice Haraway and Anne Boleyn. This isn't an exact one-to-one comparison because of what I'll get onto in a minute. And so I'm kind of going to throw Catherine Howard in here as well, the fifth wife. The reason I've thrown Catherine Howard in here is because she doesn't really line up with anyone. And the thing that she is known for, the thing that she does, is basically also something that happens to Anne Boleyn. So Alice Haraway, if you remember, is Maegor's second wife. She marries him during Aenys's reign. It's a whole rigmarole. And actually, weirdly, even though the Henry VIII thing, obviously a big difference is that he didn't have these 6 wives all at the same time, unlike Maegor, technically he did marry Anne Boleyn before he was officially annulled from Catherine of Aragon. I think they got secretly married in November 1532, then publicly married in January 1533, and then the annulment only happened in May 1533. So technically that's bigamy, which, lines up with Alice Haraway. But then the big thing that we know about Alice Haraway is that she basically got marjoried. She had a baby, but it was stillborn, and it was the first of these sort of monstrosities that, Maegor kept having. And this did happen with Anne Boleyn. She had a stillborn baby. She also had a live baby. She had Elizabeth, who would later go on to become Elizabeth I. But she doesn't count, obviously, because she's a girl, so, sons only, please. So there's a comparison there, obviously. But then Henry kind of gets sick of Anne Boleyn after a bit, and he's looking for a way to get rid of her. And so Thomas Cromwell finds a bunch of people who supposedly are her lovers. And there's loads of people who are brought in, but eventually they pin it on 5 of them, I think, including her brother, Edward Boleyn, I'm going to say. I might be confusing. To be honest, most people in this time period are either called Thomas, Edward, maybe a William and a John in there somewhere. And that's about it. That's about everyone. But regardless, so that happens to Anne Boleyn, and same thing basically happens to Alice Haraway, where Tyner of the Tower rocks up and tells Maegor that she's been sleeping around a bunch, and gets a list of names who eventually all confess under torture and get executed. Alice Haraway gets executed, or tortured to death, and her dad gets executed as well, Lucas Haraway, who we talked about in the Hands ranking video. This is obviously, same thing happening to both of them. It will also remind you of what happens to Marjorie, as I said. And Marjorie, I think, is like an explicit parallel to Anne Boleyn. So it's entirely possible Alice Haraway is just sort of a copy of Marjorie, who herself is a copy of Anne Boleyn, which I guess is which counts for our thing. And we'll throw Catherine Howard in here as well, because whereas Anne Boleyn's family do get obviously screwed over as part of her execution, one of them, Edward, maybe. I'll put a thing up there if I got that name wrong. Edward gets executed, of course, and her dad, Thomas Boleyn, loses a bunch of his lands and gets exiled from court and stuff. But her dad doesn't get executed, whereas with Catherine Howard, who is Henry's 5th wife, she basically does the same thing. Historians tend to be they're not entirely sure if Anne Boleyn actually slept around, but they tend to fall on the side of she probably didn't. It was probably just made up. Whereas with Catherine Howard, they fall on the side of she probably did, on account of the fact that she was 19 and Henry VIII was 45 or something, and was really old and obese and had ulcers and loads of horrible things. So, not exactly particularly attractive. In that sense, Catherine Howard is probably not like Alice Haraway, who probably didn't do it, just like Anne Boleyn. But the one thing that we can throw in with Catherine Howard is that her, I'm going to say, it's some sort of relation. Thomas Howard, I told you they were called Thomas, who's the Duke of Norfolk, who, by the way, is also Anne Boleyn's uncle. But anyway, he does get thrown in the Tower of London for his, role in bringing Catherine Howard to court and so on. And he is scheduled to be executed. So that's probably a closer connection in terms of Lucas Haraway getting executed than Edward. Though Thomas Howard, who is about 80 at this point, he doesn't actually get executed, because the day he was going to be executed, the king dies. So he gets a reprieve, and he survives another couple of years. So again, Catherine Howard, I think there's no one-to-one parallel for her necessarily, because Anne Boleyn fits a lot better for Alice Haraway, and everything that Catherine Howard did, Anne Boleyn did as well. So yeah, those two have been rolled into this one character, I would argue. Because there's a couple of other things with Anne Boleyn, like with Alice Haraway. Alice Haraway gets called Maegor's whore. Anne Boleyn gets called the King's whore. So it's the same nickname. Another one is that the Boleyns get all their lands nicked off them, just like the Haraways get all their lands nicked off them. So there's a bunch of stuff there that happens, which is, it's very similar. It's very similar. And moving on, we can get to the third wife of Maegor, Diana of the Tower, who is also an Anne Boleyn parallel, I would argue. So that we've got 2 Anne Boleyns and not really any Catherine Howards, but that's fine. We've still got 6 wives either way. Because Diana of the Tower represents the other side of Anne Boleyn, the fact that she was accused of witchcraft and beheaded for it. Just like Diana of the Tower is this weird sorceress, a weird foreign sorceress as well. Anne Boleyn isn't foreign, but she grew up in France and the Netherlands, and so people think she's like weird and French and stuff. Just like Diana of the Tower is from this weird foreign land. And then again, Diana of the Tower, her name includes Anna, which is, Anne Boleyn. It's like a variation of Anne Boleyn, and she would have been called Anna at the time because they all spelt their names like multiple ways. And also she's called Diana of the Tower, and Anne Boleyn, gets thrown in the Tower of London, which is called the Tower. So I mean, that's pretty close. Those are some pretty specific things, especially the whole witchcraft thing. Not many queens of England get accused of witchcraft. Not many. But yeah, so that's that lot. Then we can move on to possibly the most simple one, which is Jane Westerling and Jane Seymour. They're both called Jane, you might notice. They both die in childbirth. That's it. To be fair, those are 2 pretty big things, because Jane Seymour is the one who died. Anne Boleyn is the one who was beheaded. So we have Diana of the Tower and Alice Haraway, who were both beheaded, or at least Diana of the Tower was, and Alice Haraway was executed. And Catherine Howard was the other one who was beheaded, so you throw her in there. This is the one who died, divorced, beheaded, died. It was Jane Seymour who just died, and that's Jane Westerling. I mean, yeah, both called Jane. What more do you need? Then we get onto the 2 who survived, Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr. And we have the 2 of Maegor's wives who survived, Rhaena Targaryen and Eleanor Costaigne. So I think we should probably start with the first chronologically on Henry's side, Anne of Cleves, who is his 4th wife, who I'm matching up with Rhaena Targaryen. Now, Anne of Cleves doesn't match as closely to any of them as, say, Jane Westerling does to Jane Seymour, or Alice Haraway and Diana of the Tower do to Anne Boleyn, or Ceres Hightower does to Catherine of Aragon. However, there are a few things. So there's the survived thing, of course. Then there's the fact that Anne of Cleves she was divorced. She was queen for like less than a year. She was the one who Henry VIII got a painting of and said, oh, she looks nice, and then actually met her. Then they sort of didn't get on. And then it ended up getting divorced, and Thomas Cromwell died as a result. But after the annulment between Henry and Anne of Cleves, Anne of Cleves gets a bunch of lands. It's not like Catherine of Aragon, because she kind of goes along with it. So she gets a bunch of lands. She gets an official title and officially a member of the royal family. And these things kind of match up with Rhaena, who is a member of the royal family because she's related. And Anne of Cleves is known as the king's beloved sister. I mean, Rhaena is the king's niece and is also the next king's beloved sister, or maybe not beloved, but at least a sister. So there's one. Rhaena also gets given lands. She gets given Dragonstone initially, but then she ends up with Harrenhal. And Harrenhal was formerly owned by the Haraways, who, lost it when Maegor nicked it off them when Alice Haraway was executed. Well, he executed all the Haraways. And wouldn't you know it, Anne of Cleves got given a bunch of lands, one of the big ones being Hever Castle, which was previously the property of the Boleyns. So that's kind of a nice coincidence, isn't it? So I'd be surprised if that was deliberate, but it's pretty wild. And there's also a weird one that is not entirely related, but I just read about this, that Thomas Boleyn, Alice... no, and I'm really getting very confused mixing up the two, the real and the fictional here. But Thomas Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's dad, was Earl of Ormond, and he kept that title, but someone else got appointed Earl of Ormond a year before he died, which reminds me of Rhaena being living in Harrenhal with the last Lord Towers until the Lord Towers died. But anyway. The other thing is that Anne of Cleves fell out of royal favour after Wyatt's rebellion against Mary I, because she was suspected of helping, even though she probably didn't. And similarly, Rhaena falls out of favour with Maegor's successors, particularly after like treason by her allies, such as Alyssa Farman. So yeah, Rhaena Targaryen, Anne of Cleves. There's not that much like broad, things like there is with all the others, but there is like those weird specifics that are kind of fun. And that leaves us with the last one, the last wives, Eleanor Costain and Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife. I think this is kind of a vibes-based thing. I always had this one locked down. That Eleanor Costain just kind of feels like Catherine Parr. It's that sort of previously married. Catherine Parr is previously married. Eleanor Costain was previously married. And Eleanor Costain kind of comes along because of that in a way, because she has like experience running a household and has multiple children. Catherine Parr doesn't have any children, but she becomes like a sort of part of the royal household. The Henry VIII's previous children like her and get on with her, and she's a good stepmother to them. And it's that kind of vibe that you kind of get from Eleanor Costain. Reminds me of Catherine Parr. And beyond that, obviously, they both survived. There's also kind of an element with what happens to Eleanor Costain after Henry's death, which is that she gets involved in the faith. Well, first she goes back to her, wherever she's from, to like just sort of settle down, which Catherine Parr does. But then they both end up coming back to court or getting back involved with stuff. Eleanor Costain goes to sort of preach the faith and preach the doctrine of exceptionalism to help Jaehaerys I, while Catherine Parr is sort of a devout Protestant and ends up like writing various books, including one which was called The Lamentation of a Sinner, which promoted justification by faith alone, which is a sort of key Protestant tenet that the Catholics thought was heresy, and which reminds me of Costain preaching doctrine of exceptionalism, especially as the king was Edward VI, who was, big hardcore Protestant. So this is also a child king, like Jaehaerys. So it's very, helping out the next king with his religious problems, kind of thing. So yeah, that's the six wives, and there's a lot of parallels, aren't there? But it's not just that. The other big one is religion, right? Because Maegor I has all these religious wars about remarrying, about having multiple wives, about being an abomination. This massive thing which is kicked off by the wives, but the same thing happens with Henry VIII, Henry VIII breaks the church over the fact that he wants to get married again to Anne Boleyn. And that's the massive one, but there's like other aspects to it. For example, putting your own guy in charge of the church. Thomas Cranmer gets put in as Archbishop of Canterbury, who is, Protestant. Maegor has his high lickspittle. Both kings aren't really that devout. They're not. Henry VIII is never he still considers himself a Catholic. It's just that he's broken with the church in Rome, and he's not really, all out for the Protestants. And similarly, Maegor doesn't really seem to care that much about the religious side of things. Henry does care, but he's not like a radical reformer. And they both leave it to their successors to sort it out. Jaehaerys has to get the doctrine of exceptionalism passed, while, Edward and Mary and Elizabeth all have to have lots of problems sorting that one out. In terms of the religious revolts, Maegor obviously faces a lot of religious revolts. Henry doesn't have many on the same scale, but he has things like the Pilgrimage of Grace, which is where the Northerners revolt, in part because of religion. It's called the Pilgrimage of Grace. You take from that what you will. And they, are pretty, they're pretty dangerous. They end up taking a bunch of places. They get let into York unopposed, for example, just like how towards the end of Maegor's reign, there's people like wandering into Riverrun unopposed, like Joffrey Doggett and stuff. But the Pilgrimage of Grace doesn't end up bringing down Henry, whereas all of the rebellions against Maegor do eventually end up bringing him down. And beyond that, there's loads of like other sort of miscellaneous comparisons that you can make. For example, Maegor kills 3 of his Grand Maesters. He beheads 2 of them, at least, and kills another one with a sword. Henry VIII, similarly, you kind of end up dividing his reign into 3 bits and another bit based on his chief ministers. They don't really have like a consistent title, at this time. They have multiple titles. But the first one being Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal Wolsey, the second being Thomas More, and the third being Thomas Cromwell, all 3 of whom die. The latter 2 he executes, and Thomas Wolsey doesn't get executed, but he dies on the way to being sort of recalled when everyone thinks he's probably going to get executed, isn't he? So, kind of killing 3 of your chief advisors in succession, kind of similar to the Grand Maester thing. Oh, and also, I guess they also have the same first name. All 3 Grand Maesters have Grand Maester at the front of their name. All 3 Thomases have Thomas. So, I mean, there's that. There's a bunch of other things, like they both have a near-death experience. Maegor, of course, has his fight with the Trial of the Seven, where he's in a coma for 27 days. Henry VIII has a jousting accident in January 1536, and some historians blame this for him sort of becoming a tyrant. They think he had got like brain damage from it. But whether or not that happened, it definitely was a massive turning point in his life. He had a massive leg injury from it, which meant that he could never really exercise as much as he wanted to again. He got obese from that. He was constantly in pain. His ulcers were acting up. His leg was like withering away. So that alone can be blamed in some part for his change in personality. And similarly, Maegor, people think that near-death experience was actually a death experience, and he was then brought back to life and became a sort of horrendous zombie monster from then on. So, I mean, that's a massive one. They both liked building forts. Henry liked building forts. Maegor liked building the Red Keep. There's one. They were both sort of brave or sort of good fighters in their youth, who then become this sort of monstrous figure. They both inherit sort of a well-run kingdom, more or less, from their dads. Obviously, Maegor has a niece, but Henry VIII has Henry VII, who he inherits directly from. I guess they're both also second sons, by the way. Henry VIII's older brother Arthur died before he could become king. But they both inherit like a massive sort of war chest, a well-run economy, and then squander it massively so that their successors, are dealing with a bankrupted realm. So yeah, I mean, there's so many parallels, so many different things where you can point to. The big ones are 6 wives, divorced, beheaded and died, divorced, beheaded, survived. You can point to the massive effect on religion, and you can point to all these other little things as well. And I suppose before I move on to the sort of concluding point of whatever this video is, I should point out that before I really thought about this, if you'd asked me who is the Henry VIII parallel, I would have probably said Aegon IV, who is lecherous and fat and bloated and tyrannical, and has 8 wives, so beats Henry by 2. Or they're mistresses, aren't they? He only has 1 wife. And who causes a massive problem with the succession by constantly ruling out various children from the succession and undermining his true-born heirs, which Henry VIII does. And that's not really something Maegor does, obviously, because Maegor doesn't have any heirs, whereas Henry VIII does. He has 3 children, all of whom become king or queen at one point. And Henry VIII also does the thing where, at one point, before Edward VI is born, he's considering naming Henry Fitzroy, his bastard son, as his heir. So, bit Daemon Blackfire-ish. The thing with Henry Fitzroy is he dies before he can become king, or before he can even be made heir. So, there's that angle that doesn't really exist in the Maegor side of things, but I think Maegor is a lot closer than Aegon IV is, after looking through all this stuff. And so with all those fun little parallels, you come to the question of what's the point? What's the point of this video? I mean, it's just fun, isn't it, to look at this stuff. But it's also, I think, interesting to have a look at other similarities beyond just these things. So, for example, Henry VIII is one of the most well-known kings. He is probably the most famous king. I don't know, if there's if they did there must have been a pointless round on this at some point. He would no doubt be the most famous. I mean, I don't think many people even come close. Maybe, apart from the current queen or king, which is kind of cheating. I don't know, Victoria maybe, William the Conqueror maybe. Who else? Elizabeth. I mean, Henry VIII is the iconic King of England. If you ever have a book that's about the kings and queens of England, it will always have Henry VIII on the front cover. Maegor the Cruel doesn't quite rise to that same level, but he is certainly one of the more famous ones. There's a line in one of the Daenerys chapters where she thinks, the blood of Aegon the Conqueror and Maegor the Cruel runs in my veins. It's why do you boast about Maegor the Cruel, mate? But it's because he's a famous one, and also because I guess that passage is supposed to be the good and the bad, all the Targaryen fire and blood stuff. But there is this element with Henry VIII of he is probably one of the worst kings in English history, both in terms of like what effect he actually has, in terms of killing people and bankrupting the realm and alienating us from most of Europe and all those other things. But also in terms of personally, he's the most sort of personally tyrannical. Like, there aren't that many kings who execute that many of their close advisors, who execute their wives. I mean, that almost never happens. And Maegor the Cruel, similarly, one of the most tyrannical, if not the most tyrannical, of kings in Westerosi history. And yet, the way that we remember Henry VIII is sort of like in a strange, a kind of jokey way, you know? Henry VIII is kind of a comic character in a lot of ways. He's sort of a fat, obese man who chops off his wives' heads. And I think also because he basically ushers in Protestantism. When you look at history through that lens, it's kind of hard to have a go at him because the Protestants are the good guys in our historical view, because, well, partly because they win. But even to nowadays, even if, you know, we're like, it's the Protestants still feel like the good guys because the Catholics are the ones, you know, selling prayers to get your soul into heaven and stuff like that. And the Protestants are the ones saying, hang on a minute, there's something wrong with this. So Henry VIII, by association, gets kind of gets a pass because of that. And I think there's a similar thing going on with Maegor the Cruel. Not in universe, because in the universe everybody hates Maegor the Cruel, but in the A Song of Ice and Fire fandom, I think we similarly, or some people similarly, say Maegor's not actually that bad because of what he does with the faith, because he holds back the faith, because he gets the doctrine of exceptionalism. His actions lead to doctrine of exceptionalism. It leads to the disarming of the faith militant. And I think that's very interesting because in a similar way that Henry VIII, viewed by English historians, England being a Protestant country with an established Protestant church, we will look back and say, yes, that he is obviously a tyrant, but if we're not for Henry VIII, do we have Protestantism in England? Maybe not. In the same way that we, the readers, looking back at Maegor the Cruel, we say, yeah, tyrant, but if we don't have Maegor the Cruel, do we have the Targaryens as a extended dynasty? And the thing is, of course, that we, the readers, we're not Targaryens. Why should we care whether or not they continue their reign or whether they're cast out by the faith and replaced with someone a bit less incesty? And I think that's just because we, the readers, like the Targaryens because they're cool, and because we like Daenerys, and because they have dragons, and because the history of the Targaryens, because they are the winners for most of history. So most of history sees them as the good guys. And the faith, the eventual way that the faith shakes out is that it shakes out in their favour. The doctrine of exceptionalism gets brought in. So I think there's an interesting parallel there that, I don't know, I thought was interesting. And beyond that, I suppose the other aspect that's the difference between Henry VIII and Maegor the Cruel is that Maegor the Cruel is a lot more grimdark, you know? He doesn't just execute his wives, he has them tortured to death over, you know, weeks on end. He doesn't just have a near-death experience, he goes into a coma for 27 days and then comes back as a monster. He doesn't just put down rebellions, you know, he burns them all with dragon fire. He executes people with his own hand, with his own sword. He doesn't get someone else to do it. I mean, comparing Alice Haraway to Anne Boleyn, for example. Anne Boleyn, when they executed her, Henry VIII, you know, it was a lovely gesture. He got in a French executioner who was like the Lionel Messi of executioners or something. You know, so it's like, oh, look, he spent all this money on getting this really good executioner so that she wouldn't suffer. Whereas Maegor the Cruel, as I said, has Alice Haraway tortured to death for weeks. And so Maegor the Cruel is, I mean, he's called the Cruel. He's a more heightened version of Henry VIII. He's a much more evil version of Henry VIII. Even though Henry VIII is evil, Maegor the Cruel is more cartoonishly evil, whereas Henry VIII's evil is more human, I guess. It's more, you can imagine Henry VIII as a human being, whereas you can't necessarily with Maegor the Cruel. He's just he is literally a zombie, possibly. at various points. In that sense, it's that sort of dark fantasy take on Henry VIII, turning everything up to 11. And I suppose what that reveals is that, I don't know, Germ likes to do that. There's not that much interesting, although one thing I will mention with this comparison, to continue my ongoing quest to convince everyone that Maegor the Cruel did not solve the problems that he created by marrying all these people, that he didn't put down the faith, he didn't sort it all out. You know, Henry VIII did not have nearly as many problems as Maegor the Cruel did. Do you know why? It's because he didn't go around burning people. Well, he did actually. In terms of, he did burn people at the stake quite a lot. But I mean, he didn't go around just massacring everyone. And when that Pilgrimage of Grace rose up, when they, were conquering York under Robert Aske, the lawyer. Well, they weren't conquering. No, York was getting behind them. Robert Aske, he goes to negotiate with Henry VIII's bloke, our good friend Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. And instead of, burning him alive or anything like Maegor the Cruel would have done, Thomas Howard says, yeah, well, what do you want? You want, us to not have this sort of religious imposition of Protestantism, and you want us, to not have all your land enclosed, and you want these other things. Yeah, go on then, sure. And then Robert Aske is like, yep, job's done. Bob's your uncle. That's done. And off he goes. And then it doesn't happen. And then eventually Robert Aske does end up getting executed. But the thing is, obviously that's pretty bad, right? It's obviously pretty mean, but that comparison there, Maegor the Cruel, burning everyone, you can get a lot more done with a kind word and a gun than you can with just a kind word, sure. But you can get a lot more done with a kind word and a gun than you can with just a gun, I reckon. So maybe that's another lesson from this comparison of Maegor with Henry VIII. Maegor ruled for 6 years and then was overthrown, killed by a chair. Henry VIII, even though he was a tyrant, he died of natural causes. He ruled for 36 years or something, or 38 years. Yeah, 38 years. Ludicrously long time. So yeah, that's my comparison of Henry VIII and Maegor the Cruel. It's not just the 6 wives, it's also religion and also a bunch of other things. Was it deliberate? Is it intentional? Don't ask me, mate. I mean, there's a lot of things from this kind of period, like I said, Anne Boleyn and Marjorie. That's a pretty clear parallel. So obviously this is a kind of, Jane Westling, Jane Seymour, Cerise Hightower and Catherine of Aragon. I think the Anne of Cleves, Raina, is probably nothing. And Catherine Parr, Eleanor Costain, similarly, probably nothing. But it's interesting that once you get into this kind of thing, you can sort of look and find parallels, even very specific parallels, because, if there's enough stuff, you'll find patterns. And maybe that's the other lesson. Just because there's a coincidence doesn't mean it's intended, which I know is anathema to this whole project of A Song of Ice and Fire theories. But, we're just having fun here. It doesn't matter whether it's intended or not. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for watching. And yeah, that's about it. I don't know what my next video is going to be. Actually, I have an idea. And after that one, I might rank all the King's Guard, which would take 4 hours. But I might do that, because why not? Anyway, goodbye.